Not ready yet. Good morning. My name is Dr. Todd Bowman, and I'm the coordinator of the Sexual Addiction Treatment Provider Postgraduate Certification Program at Mid-America Nazarene University in Olathe, Kansas. Today we're here with Justin Wack, the founder of Saavi Accountability, which is an online accountability program to help work with individuals who are struggling from sexually addictive behaviors. We've really seen a rise clinically in the prevalence of individuals reporting some sort of sexually addictive behavior, compulsive masturbation, serial affairs, different types of intrusions on the family life, the relational dyad, that all stem from problematic sexual behaviors. And if you know anything about sexual addictions, it's been dubbed intimacy disorders. So what we've done is we feel pretty lucky to be on the front edge educationally in putting together a curriculum that equips clinicians with how to best treat and how to address the issue of sexually addictive behaviors. The unique thing about our track is that it's two-pronged. One track is specifically designed for clinicians, social workers, psychologists, counselors, etc., who are on the front lines providing much of the treatment and therapy for individuals who are struggling with sexually addictive behaviors. The second prong of our program is more intentionally designed around individuals who are serving in a ministerial capacity or in a lay capacity, providing psychoeducation or ministering to individuals struggling with these types of behaviors. The reason that we've decided to partner with Saavi Accountability really resides in the underlying emphasis that Justin has built into this product. Specifically, a move from a very cognitive approach to treatment to a much more relational approach to treatment. Patrick Carnes, back in the 80s, published his first work called Out of the Shadows. It was the first work to really address the idea of sexual addictions or sexually addictive behaviors. That book and the subsequent work that's followed has really primarily been oriented around restructuring cognitions. The rise of cognitive behavioral therapy was well underway when Dr. Carnes authored that first work. What we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years in the field of psychotherapy, specifically neuroscience, neuropsychology, and what some folks call affective neuroscience with the emotional centers of the brain, is that we're really geared much more and designed biologically for connection, for intimacy. And what we're seeing is the breakdown of our capacity for connection and intimacy with folks who are so immersed in pornography or who have centered their lives so much around sexual gratification and not around emotional connection. So this product of Saavi Accountability really harnesses that notion of what it means to be relational, to be intimate, to be designed for human connection, and really seeks to help facilitate in the life of the individual who's struggling with these behaviors a different level of capacity for connection. So I think that there's been a hesitancy, Justin, to make this shift in the field, and I think that comes from just a couple of different barriers or misunderstandings that people have. And what I'd like to do is just ask you what those barriers are and how this product really works to overcome some of those barriers that the individual might be experiencing in their recovery.
Sure. Yeah, we definitely see that being a real barrier as far as this shift into more of a relational approach, because it just seems like people don't want to deal with these issues kind of really at a real at a heart level, and I think that's what that relationship, that's what that vulnerability really brings into play is this this real, I guess, tough aspect of relationship, that you have to be open, you have to be vulnerable, and so we see people just not really wanting to, they know they have an issue, they know that they're sitting hours on end in front of a screen looking at pornography, destroying their relationships, destroying their families, but when it comes time to actually deal with it, what does that mean? Well, I need to bring some accountability into the picture. I need to bring a pastor, a therapist. I need to bring a friend. Download Saavi Accountability and bring a friend in as my accountability partner. Well, what does that look like? That's a pretty vulnerable, pretty open place to be. And so we see that just really kind of being a barrier that causes people to not want to deal with the issue.
Yeah. So the first thing that pops in my mind is a 12-step process. If you're a therapist working with folks and your clients are a part of a 12-step process, or if you're a pastor and you frequently refer folks to things like freedom groups or AA, more specifically for this topic, things like SA and SAA, this is a great way for folks to partner in accountability in the midst of the recovery in those programs. That really supplements and again brings that intentional level of relationship to bear in the midst of the recovery. So it seems like this is a topic that people have a really difficult time acknowledging within themselves or wanting to even talk about. Can you talk some about the difficulty that people have with owning their struggle?
Oh, sure. I think it's a lot of times it's kind of at the head level, and so we see people kind of dealing with it at the head level, but not in the heart. And so we see, people will come forward and maybe come to check out SaaviAccountability.com or come to some of our sessions and really acknowledge that the problem exists, maybe even acknowledge the problem exists in their own life. But then that's kind of where it ends. It's like we said earlier, it's really tough to kind of take that next step and really do something about it. And so that that's what we're trying to help individuals overcome. And I think you're doing a great job from the clinical and institutional side of that, of really moving clinicians and pastors to a point to be able to bring people to this place where they're openly dealing with this stuff, as opposed to just giving it kind of lip service and just talking about it and saying, yeah, it's a problem, but really not sure how to do anything about it, or I'm not sure I'm ready to do anything about it. And I think that's really what we see a lot is, the number of people, if I go speak somewhere, the number of people that come up and tell me their stories and share their struggles with me is really overwhelming. And yet the amount of people that we see truly overcoming it is a lot lower. And so we're really making this push to try to help individuals, bring them to that point. And first of all, I think it comes with understanding. I mean, the stuff that you're sharing is understanding what it really takes to move from that place of acknowledging it in your head, but then actually dealing with it in your heart, because it truly is a heart issue. It truly is something that you have to overcome in your heart to deal with in your heart to overcome these issues. I mean, it's a huge struggle. It's a huge addictive behavior. I mean, we've talked about that many times of really how addictive this stuff is, which I know you can share a little more on. But how do people move past that? What do they do? Okay, what's the first step? And we see it. I hear you saying it, and I know I'm shared that many times. It's relationship. It's all about relationship, and bringing and helping individuals get to the point where they can understand what it's going to take in that relationship to truly deal with the problem. And it's just vulnerability. It's transparency. It's honesty.
Yeah, and those of you familiar with Dr. Karn's model, I think the entire professional community that deals with sexual addictions agrees on this. Very much a shame-based model of being, a shame-driven experience that most folks are reporting when we get into the clinical work. There's some shameful trauma or some shameful sexual experience or some shameful belief system that really drives that addictive behavior, that sexual acting out. And Justin, I agree with you 100% that the whole notion of shame is really only deconstructed in the context of vulnerable, authentic connection relationally with another person in a healthy way. I think that's the misrepresentation of intimacy is when the emphasis is just sexually, but when there's a very holistic intimacy, an emotional intimacy, a physical intimacy, a spiritual intimacy, that's when we really start seeing recovery become successful and effective for these folks.
Right, yeah, and that's definitely, when I started, I developed Saavi Accountability right out of college, and recognizing in my life the areas and the points in time when this wasn't a struggle, when I had so to speak, overcame the issue in that period of my life with pornography, and it all came back to relationship. And so that's why and that's where we really got involved is helping individuals understand it and helping myself understand. Okay, why is it that whether it's relationship with my parents, relationship with the girlfriend, relationship with my friends, that I'm really overcoming these things? Why is it in those moments easier to deal with than other moments? And what does that look like? And then how can we build a technology to really facilitate that? And that's what that we've done with Saavi Accountability. Is for me, I recognize that it was a problem that I wanted to be able to overcome on my own. And it seemed like, as far as other technologies and stuff that I'd use and my friends had used in college, that they were more there just to mask, kind of put a band-aid on the issue. I wanted to overcome the issue. I wanted to be able to not click on that site for myself, not because something was stopping me. And so I wanted to build Saavi Accountability to facilitate that, but not be the solution, And so it really do everything we can to help people come to that place of relationship, to facilitate that through technology. And so that's why, as my accountability partner, you receive a text message 10, 20 seconds after I would click on the site. And so, instantly. I mean, that's relationship happens like this right now, And so with you being able to call me, 30 seconds later and say, hey, what are you doing? You want me to hold you accountable? You know, that's that support in the moment of when it's needed the most. And so that's really the whole idea around what we do with Saavi Accountability, and exactly what you're talking about with the program that you've developed, being this relational approach, and really bringing people to that point.
Yeah, I mean, you can already hear just the change in the nature of accountability that Justin has created with Saavi. The archaic approach of perhaps a once a week update, or if that's all you're getting. Again, the notion of immediacy is such a huge part of the counseling process, and the beauty of what Justin's developed here is that it takes that notion of immediacy and brings it into the realm of accountability. And as soon as that process is enacted with the text message being sent or the email being sent and received by the accountability partner, there can be in the moment some connection, some vulnerability, some move away from that sexual acting out and a move towards a better understanding of what's driven the addiction, but also a different choice or different experience moving forward. So we see certainly that cognitive element is important, but that experiential, that new experience, that different experience of not falling prey to the sexual temptation, to not acting out in the same way as perhaps has been done historically outside of the context of accountability, is just really amazing to see how that process comes together. And it's not just useful, it's actually really strong neuroscience as well. So if you've studied the neuroscience of addiction, if you've read books like Wired for Intimacy by Bill Struthers up at Wheaton College, you understand that. And if you haven't read that, it's a great book to check out. It's called Wired for Intimacy by William Struthers, Bill Struthers. Amazing to see the application of neuroscience in the recovery process now, and Justin's done a great job of building that intentionally into what's being done.
That's something very interesting that I'd like you to share, because it fascinates me every time you talk about it. But when we talk about the level of addiction that takes place with things like porn, I mean, so many times people will compare it to, well, is it, is dabbling in it here and there, is it that bad? Is it like, having a beer or having a cigarette? If you're really not addicted, and what I've really learned from you is that's simply not what I've experienced, as well as from the clinical standpoint. I'm learning that that's really not the case. But also looking at what I think you guys have done a great job of addressing is this overall, so many times addictions come paired, or two or three at a time.
Absolutely.
And so
Yep.
just dealing with something like pornography, struggling with that, and only focusing on that one thing, that one item in your life, as opposed to your whole life, is really going to be insufficient, because what's the next thing going to be? I mean, maybe you get that under control, but so many times people turn to something else. Maybe it's gambling, maybe it's online gaming, maybe it's something offline, like alcohol or whatever it may be. So talk a little bit about that addictive nature, and really how powerful that is, as well as how it's coupled so many times.
Sure. I think the primary driving variable that you're talking about with Dr. Mark Glazer would call it addiction interaction disorder, meaning that addictions typically show up in 2s or 3s or 4s, is that at the neurotransmitter level, each of those experiences, eating food, um, online gaming, even things like running or the recovery process itself for some of my clients have preyed on or kind of fallen back into this pattern of even good things, things that we're naturally created for, like again, eating, um, exercise, recovery, all of a sudden are hijacked by this same dopaminergic process where we're conditioning ourselves into being addicted to the recovery, just like we were addicted. So we're not really recovering in that context. We're just trading out what it is that kind of we're bonded to or held in bondage by.
Right.
Oh, the book that comes to mind is called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. It was written by a Stanford physiologist called Robert Sapolsky. One of my favorite reads of all time. And what he talks about, and it's a book on stress and endocrinology, so it's kind of a fascinating read medically. But one of the things that sticks out in my mind is he has a chapter on pleasure and the role of dopamine in our experience. And the issue with dopamine, we've used the dopamine hypothesis in mental health for long periods of time. First, we thought it caused schizophrenia, then we thought it caused bipolar illnesses. Dopamine is actually a very good thing. Procreation, right, needs to be a pleasurable thing. But what happens is, and again, if I can borrow Dr. Struther's term, we've hijacked our pleasure systems, and we're creating immense amounts of dopamine, which, although in the short period gives us a high, creates all sorts of unintended and unhealthy consequences. In the literature, you might have seen things like a dopamine hangover, and that can come from anything from gaming online too long to jumping out of an airplane. And once the adrenaline and dopamine are gone, there's this kind of depressed period, this languishing that takes place within the individual. So dopamine, a very powerful chemical that creates an intense experience of pleasure. But again, we live in a culture where drugs and alcohol produce and can hijack that dopamine system. Even how we eat, how we exercise, we're so focused on pleasure. And at the dopaminergic level, literally, we're burning out our brain's capacity to experience pleasure, which in turn enacts that addictive process. It's why we need more and more of the same substance or the same experience to get the same effect. If you look at the DSM-4, that is known as tolerance, needing more and more of the same experience or same substance to get the same effect. So our culture, our economy in particular, really preys on the next, the biggest, the most exciting. And ultimately what happens is that's an unsustainable neurological process that's going to leave us burnt out, leave us a little bit anhedonic, or that dopamine hangover taking place. And then B, it's going to drive us back to that same experience unless we ground ourselves in things like relationship and a very balanced and much more holistic approach to sex, to eating, to exercise. Our culture is one that's defined by consuming excess or experiencing in excess, when in actuality, our physiology is designed for balance, not for excess.
So I see what you're saying is just dealing with something like specifically pornography is great in and of itself, but then we're still going to be seeking that dopamine high. So that's why we turn to something like eating or like a therapeutic approach, or you volunteering too much at church. I mean, I've heard you say that there is a balance in all this stuff. I mean, doing good things doesn't necessarily fix the problem, because that can become an addiction of itself. And so constantly just filling your time with volunteering it, where it's a good thing. It's not you don't look at it like pornography. This is really damaging you every time you. But over the long term, that
right.
That we're just seeking that high in any way we can get it, other than vulnerability in relationship. And
yeah, it really is. My clients typically talk about a self-medication process or a numbing process. It's like pornography or eating becomes a medication, and that medication, if it's true that pornography and sexual addictions are an intimacy disorder, it becomes a way of numbing the fear of vulnerability, the pain of vulnerability, the past experiences where intimacy or vulnerability was really poorly managed or harmful to the individual in some way. So absolutely, it's moving from that place of hiding, right? Shame are very much about covering and hiding. So the reason I said they're antithetical to vulnerability earlier is because vulnerability is so much more about trust and openness,
Right.
and just really authenticity, and,
Right.
and trusting that the other person will receive you well and not injure you.
Right.
But we create lots of ways of hiding from that intimacy. Again, sometimes it's food, sometimes even the recovery process itself just takes the place of, and there's a host of, we could get into the science of the nucleus of humans and talk about why that takes place and the chemicals involved. That might be better saved for another opportunity to talk further in depth about this.
Right.
But absolutely, it's a biological process that leaves us kind of vulnerable to trading out addictions or to swapping what it is we're addicted to, instead of really addressing the core issue through connection, through intimacy, through vulnerability.
So pornography in and of itself a lot of times isn't the core issue. It's a lot of times what you're saying is that that's how it's carried out, but it sounds like really intimacy is what's really being sought after.
Yep, absolutely.
And so, and you mentioned online gaming. Another thing that I wanted to do when developing Saavi Accountability was not just deal with the sole issue of pornography, because coming out of my experiences, that's what I wanted to deal with. It was a struggle. It was something I kept coming back to even when I didn't want to. And so, I knew I needed something more to help me get through that. But I also had friends that in college, I had two friends dropped out of college because of online gaming addictions. And so it's not just that pornography piece that we want to address with Saavi. It's this life accountability. It's you're watching TV, you're walking down the street and see an attractive girl. We're so bombarded by sexual images in our culture. It's not like alcohol or cigarettes that you can get away from it. It's going to find you. And so how do we deal with that in and of ourselves? How do we deal with that in our own minds when we do see that, and provide a platform to help people have that relationship in place on the computer, outside the computer, and the important piece being that outside the computer, and helping that relationship get them through it.
So we've talked about this and kind of dubbed this a 12-step plus program, meaning it goes above and beyond just those 12 steps to a lifestyle reorientation with how folks are living. Talk to us a little bit more about the unavoidability of sexual stimuli in our culture. It seems like everywhere I go, a billboard, or I was just at the airport traveling the last couple weeks, magazine, you name it, everything, commercials, everything is just saturated in sexual stimuli. Talk to us about A, how unavoidable that is, but B, how Saavi really is designed to help change things internally,
right,
so that opportunity, that trigger that might facilitate an acting out process can all of a sudden be managed differently.
Sure. How can we, how is it unavoidable? That's a pretty big, we can't get away from it, whether it's TV. Sex sells. And so everything, whether it's laundry detergent, Donald Miller talks about in one of his books, I think it's Blue Like Jazz, but he talks about the difference between U.S. and Canada, and how in Canada a bottle of laundry detergent, dish detergent is used to clean off your dishes. In America, it's to get you laid, and that is really the truth behind all this, is that everything from a pair of jeans to laundry detergent, dish detergent, or new TV, everything is so sexualized that no matter what we do, we can't get away from it. Especially, and we certainly know that it's not just an issue for guys. We see females dealing with this at a much higher rate than ever before, but we can't get away from it. And so the whole process, the whole idea now becomes, how do you deal with it in your mind? How do you deal with it in your head to get you through those times when, whether it's the computer is a huge piece. That's why we've developed a program that keeps you accountable on your computer. But it's not just on the computer. You're going to be bombarded by this stuff in your everyday lives. And so how are you going to deal with it at that point? And so what Saavi allows you to do is have that relationship in place to where, that accountability relationship, traditionally it's, we hear about it or we read about it or when we see it as somebody asking you questions to kind of keep you accountable for whatever it is you're dealing with in your life. Maybe it's pornography, maybe it's daily devotionals, maybe it's alcohol, whatever it may be. But really moving past just that to a point where your accountability relationship becomes you reaching out to your accountability partner. We've come to this point, and I've kind of experienced that in my own accountability relationship with one of my friends. Is that it's not a thing of him calling me and asking how I'm doing, or he's not getting reports or instant notifications on my Saavi account because I'm simply not doing it anymore. But what are the other stimuli in my life that are causing some of these stumbles? And so having that conversation in place gives us the opportunity to say, hey, ask me about this. When you get that weekly report, it's telling you everything's clean on the computer, but use that as a reminder to just ask me about X, Y, and Z. And so that's really how, with Saavi, we've tried to help people, once again, facilitate that relationship, to bring up these things and talk about these things in a way that's just not built based around the computer. It's overall, everything that's going on in their life, what they're watching on TV, how they're handling situations with an individual at work.
Yeah, and that seems like that's where other products have stopped short. Is it's almost the assumption that one of Dr. Carnes' core beliefs of a sexual addict is that sex is my most important need. These other products and programs that are out there, it seems like once the struggle with pornography is done, or once the issue on the computer is resolved, that's where those programs stop. And I think the errancy there, the logical fallacy that exists is, like Justin has shared, it's so much bigger than just that struggle sexually, because that struggle sexually is just one facet of our being or who we're created as. We're cognitive people, we're spiritual people, we're physical people, and we can't assume that just because one area of our lives has experienced some sort of healing or corrective process, that all those other parts will necessarily follow suit. It's a lifestyle issue. It's a change issue. That's reflected neurologically. It's reflected in the literature. And I'm appreciative, as a clinician myself, to have a program in place to refer clients to help them understand and reorient their lives completely. Not just sexually, not just to put it away and to escape the shame of their sexual acting out, but to really have the freedom and liberation that comes from a life lived well in all areas. And that's really my experience with Saavi, with the clients who have utilized it, is that they have a different understanding of themselves holistically, and as such they're able to live holistically healthy lives instead of just sexually healthy lives.
Right. Now I'm getting a message here that we have quite a few individuals that want for some questions at the end, and so we'll log in to Facebook to get those questions as well. But kind of one last thing, talk to us a little bit about, you've mentioned in the past the relationship between the online gaming industry and the porn industry, and obviously something that I just mentioned, we're trying to deal with it at Saavi as well, is the online gaming addiction that's becoming just huge, and I've seen it play out in a couple of my friends' lives, very destructive, and you've mentioned before that the relationship between those two industries and how they're in bed together. Talk to us a little bit about that, because I think that's something that's
Sure.
very new.
Yeah, probably the best resource published in 2010, and it might have been January 2011, by the Witherspoon Institute. They're a research group on the East Coast that specifically studies the social impact of pornography. They released a book, a number of books actually. Again, late 2010, it might have been early 2011. I can't remember the exact publication date. But I think it's a series. It's 2 or 3 books called "The Social Costs of Pornography," and the edition I'm thinking of is called "The Social Costs of Pornography: A Collection of Papers," and it's edited by Stoner, and I believe Stoner and Hughes. It might be 2, but the chapters of the book are just ripe with sociological information about, for years and years, the notion of pornography or sex addiction has been argued from a very moral perspective or a spiritual perspective. It's right or it's wrong. And what we're finding in the sociological literature is that it's a sociological issue. It's not just about morality. It's about is reshaping communities, and not necessarily in healthy ways. Specifically, the one thing that jumps out in my mind from that read is the belief in the rape myth, that individuals who spend more time um, online viewing pornography or engaged in sexual acting out online with pornography are 5 to 10 times more likely to believe the rape myth, specifically that women who are raped want to be raped, women who are raped enjoy being raped, and that there's no consequence emotionally to the rape actually happening. You can see how distorted and how perverse that mindset really becomes. That's the sociological science. That's the sociological research that's being done. It's not from a spiritual perspective. It's not from a moral perspective. That's just the black and white of science at a sociological level. And there's this shift that we're seeing. It's a distortion of belief, that how could we think that folks who are subjected to this unexpected trauma, this invasion of most intimate parts of their being, could actually enjoy that and somehow want that experience to take place. That book articulates the relationship between pornography companies and these gaming companies, where we've seen in the last 10 years the explosion of games like Leisure Suit Larry, Magna Cum Laude, where sex is actually the primary driving focus of the game. It's the consumption of pornography just in a different way. Technology is changing. The means by which we access pornography is changing, and the dependence that folks have, that you might walk around and see on the street and never know that they're struggling, right? If it's a drug addict, you might see their tracks. You might see in their eyes there's a difference. This is a very silent addiction. It's one that can be engaged in from the privacy of one's dorm room, from one's home, from one's phone anymore. But the gaming industry, right, hijacks that same system. A lot of anticipation, a lot of experience of high dopaminergic pleasure with video games, with adrenaline, and that kind of toxic combination of adrenaline and dopamine. It's the reason in the porn industry we see an escalation. Folks don't just dabble and stay with home movies or fetishes. Typically, there's an escalation into violent forms of pornography and child pornography, both very deviant. Why? Because that excitatory process with adrenaline paired with the pleasure of dopamine isn't easily satisfied, right? It takes more and more deviance, more and more intensity for that same threshold of pleasure to be reached. So gaming does that same thing. We see the intentional inclusion of sexual content paired with games that have more violence and are more adrenaline inducing. Those companies are, excuse the pun, in bed with one another, and it makes sense neurologically. It's because they're enacting the same type of neurological experience.
So that's why we see, back to a lot of times these addictions being coupled with each other, that it's the same, it's something different that's driving it, but the process that's going on, the chemicals, the interaction in our brain, it is the same whether you're dealing with this, that, or the other thing. And so whether it's pornography, whether it's these violent games, it's bringing about the same response, and that's the response is really what we're after. And so we can see how that definitely relates.
Yeah, if anything, just to sum that up, it almost rewires the brain for fantasy. It rewires the brain for an untrue reality, instead of living grounded in what's here, what's now, the physical touch of a hand, the physical feeling of a kiss on one's lips. It is literally rewiring people's brains so that they cue on fantasy, they cue on movie, they cue on anime, they cue on something false that's right, two-dimensional instead of the reality of a three-dimensional.
Right. Well, yeah, that's good stuff. We've got some questions. Thanks for bearing with us with some of the technical issues at the beginning. But we're going to log back in here to the Facebook account and get some of the questions that you guys would like answered, and you can go ahead and answer those. So if you could bear with us for just 1 second, we'll go in and do that.
While Justin's doing that, let me just talk with you for a little bit about, I mentioned the grounding nature of physical touch. One of the reasons physical touch is so important is because it combats that presence of dopamine. Dopamine is an important neurotransmitter in human experience, but it's also toxic. So too much dopamine left in our brains actually, again, I think I said this earlier, begins to damage our brains. What we see happening with physical touch, so specifically with something like the difference between masturbating to pornography versus sexual intimacy with one's spouse. Um, the the role of physical touch is just like it is when a mother is breastfeeding, when we hug our siblings, when we hug our parents, when we hug our friends. That role of skin to skin contact, of physical touch, releases a number of hormones and neurotransmitters, most notably oxytocin and vasopressin. Those are the hormones of connection. They're the hormones that have been demonstrated to facilitate trust, to facilitate connection. It makes sense. Think about a breastfeeding mother. We want high amounts of oxytocin to be released during that experience so that she pair bonds with her child. The same thing takes place during intercourse. That we have that dopamine spike that actually peaks before orgasm. And then dopamine is designed to fall off sharply. The reason that we're so prone to cuddling and holding, and women more particularly than men, because they have higher amounts of oxytocin that occur naturally. We're designed in that moment to bond, to spend time feeling warm and heavy and satisfied. That's the pair bonding taking place. That's this intimacy. Norman Diage, who's a noted neurologist, neurophysiologist, has a famous quote that says, "Trust is not forged in the foreplay, it's formed in the afterplay." And that quote really sums up nicely the notion of sex isn't about get in, get off, get out, and then move to the next conquest. Intimacy in sexuality is really designed around the touching, the caressing, the holding that takes place after our pleasure has been sated physically.
Okay. We'll take first question here. How exactly do you undo someone's fetish or years and years of socialization? For example, men's sexuality is shaped by porn, and often their wives and girlfriends don't want to participate in those acts, and often men buy prostitutes in order to fulfill these desires. This is a great example of how porn is directly connected to prostitution.
Yeah, you want me to take this one, or do you want to?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, you're right on. I think that so much of that deviant desire or those deviant sexual experiences that folks want, good for ladies out there who are willing to put up those boundaries. Some of those things are not facilitating of connection. Some of the fetishes that are out there, sometimes are they harmless? Yeah, I think they're harmless when both people agree that it's an okay part, it's been a negotiated part of their sexual experience, but B, it's not exclusive, meaning that it's not the only way that sexual contact is taking place. Are games fun? Is tickling fun? Is getting dressed up fun? Absolutely, but that's supplementary. That's not designed to be the entirety of our sexual diet. Just like I love a good Snickers, I love Twix. That's not my full diet. That's a place to visit once a month, once in a while. Why? Because it's sugary. It's anything, if anything, tricking my body into feeling full. Right? The notion of a sugar rush after a candy bar, and it's just tricking our bodies into feeling full and satisfied. And 30 minutes later, we're not. I would say that deviant sexual behavior, pornography, operates the same way. There's a heightened emotion. There's a heightened arousal that takes place, but it can't satisfy. Why? Because it's not facilitating true intimacy. It's not facilitating true emotional connection. Part B of your question here is, how do we undo someone's fetish or years of socialization? I think that's part of the need for therapy. That there's certainly power in an objective third party being able to help point out blind spots, to help you explore through and disentangle some of where those beliefs or where the pairing between that fetish or that belief system about sex was forged. Again, Karn said it best. That core belief is sex is my most important need. The clients that I work with, they come in believing that, and the process of psychotherapy is helping disentangle that belief system. Where was it forged, and how has it created problematic relationship instead of facilitated healthy relationship with their sexual partners, their spouses.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned the need sometimes for a third party. We look at this whole idea, we've talked now for half an hour about the importance of relationship and all of this stuff, and but we also know that a lot of people, a lot of times, don't have a trusted relationship they can go to, and so sometimes, turning to a professional, whether it be a pastor, at your church, or a professional therapist, that can help you kind of at the beginning negotiate that, as well as help you find that other relationship in your life, to help bring it in. And what does that look like? It's not an easy thing, to be an accountability partner with somebody. So many times we see how they just fizzle out. They're strong for a month or two and then they just fizzle out. It's a commitment. It's not an easy thing to do, and so bringing somebody else in at some point, especially maybe at the beginning where there's been a lot of hurt, there's been a lot of damage, and so kind of getting us back on the right track. It can be necessary sometimes to bring in someone like that, to help negotiate that stuff at the forefront. So looks like we have another question. Why do we as women have to stay in the reality while men can go off in fantasy land without any guilt? I'll let you answer that, but I think that my initial response to that is going out to the fantasy land without any guilt. I think our culture tells us that. I think that we're driven to believe that there's not any guilt there, when in reality, this is a very hidden issue and struggle, and so there is so much guilt, there is so much shame. And that's part of the addictive nature of this of pornography, is that there's so much shame behind it, that those things are being experienced. And so I think and I'll let you speak to this as well, but I think as men, we're supposed to put on kind of this front that it's just normal, it's just no big deal, whatever. But in reality, why is it that in college I'm struggling, my friends are struggling with this, and yet we want to overcome it, at a Christian college, no less, and so if you want to say that the morals are were in place, yet it was something kept coming back to. Why is it that you don't want to do it? Paul says in Romans, I know what I want to do, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. Why is it? Why is it like that? It's there's a shame that you feel terrible afterwards, and so the only way to get through that feeling, to get through that dopamine hangover, as you put it, is to go back and get more. And so the actual thing that's driving it is that shame and guilt of doing it in the first place. So,
yeah. I would add to that, and by saying that. I think the reason more men go to fantasy is because they're more primed in the sexual experience to close their eyes. What happens when we close our eyes? We're automatically putting ourselves in a place of imagination, a place of desire, a place of fantasy. And I don't think it's because men are more prone to do that biologically than women. I think it goes back to socialization. I see one of the next questions coming up here asks about socialization, so if I can double dip with an answer. I think it's because men have been raised to be very passive, to not demonstrate emotion, to think of the catchphrase, big boys don't cry, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, make something of yourself. All of that entails shutting off those vulnerable emotions. You don't acknowledge fear, you don't acknowledge guilt or shame, you don't acknowledge hurt. Well, the way our brains work, it's a very exclusionary process. It's kind of all or nothing, right? We're either utilizing or exciting the limbic system, the emotional midbrain, or we're not. Why? Because emotions all are housed there. They all exist there. So when men have been brought up not going to an emotional place, they become pretty avoidant of it. I think the reason that men engage in fantasy or close their eyes more during sex is because they don't know how to experience that emotion. When I work with couples, one of the things that I mandate is that during sexual contact, they look in each other's eyes, right? They experience the pleasure and they find the meaning and they connect through that eye-to-eye contact. Look at pornography. So much of pornography is not about eye-to-eye contact at all. If anything, the videos are about faces and body parts and zooming in on the experience of sex, and the eye-to-eye contact takes place between typically the female actor who's being pleasured and whoever it is that's viewing the pornography. It's not with the sexual partner at all. So men, unfortunately, are more comfortable experiencing that false intimacy through connection with the actress in the film instead of connecting in that moment of pleasure and intimacy with their wives. Um, so I think that combating so much of that fantasy land that guys easily go to. We could even talk about, you go to the mall and all of a sudden you've got 17 images in your brain that are accessible whenever you want them if you need to fantasize. So that's a social issue as well. But what helps compete against sliding into that fantasy process is eyes open, connecting visually, eye-to-eye contact with your spouse during that sexual experience. That's where there's so much corrective experience. I've got clients that come back and tell me about just weeping during intercourse with their wives because they've never been able to feel like they're lovable. They've never been able to feel like they could satisfy somebody. Why? Because they've believed all these lies about what masculinity and manhood really is. And all of a sudden, when manhood becomes about being pleasing to somebody and satisfying somebody and nurturing somebody and tending carefully to somebody, they can't contain, right? They've accessed this part of themselves emotionally and neurologically that they've shut off for so long. It's a profoundly corrective experience to have that eye-to-eye contact during intercourse. So sorry to get on a soapbox and have a long answer to a question here, but definitely a huge issue that I think does go unaddressed, and we allow men to. And the next question is, are men more socialized for being visually stimulated, or I think part of that is the structure and function of men's brains. There's a piece of our brain called the corpus callosum that connects our hemispheres, our right hemisphere and our left hemisphere, both kind of work in symmetry to one another, but do uniquely different things. Women out there in the audience, your brains are actually more healthy than all the men's. The least healthy female brain is probably still healthier than the most healthy male brain. Why? Because that corpus callosum is about 7 times stronger than a male, 7 times thicker than a male's. So what we have is those hemispheres kind of communicating bilaterally, meaning that the nurture side and the logic side communicate more efficiently, more readily, more frequently during the day than men's. What does that do? That allows women to nurture, to multitask, to plan, to do life and engage the world differently. Whereas men, your criticism of us, probably rightfully so sometimes, is we're too focused on work or too focused on sex. This isn't a cop-out. Men have to do a better job of becoming nurturers and doing the work of connecting both parts of their brain. But we're more geared towards one task, right? Go out, hunt, kill, conquer, do this thing. At its most extreme version, that's pretty problematic. Right? We live in a culture where the most extreme version of that has created poverty and sexism and all the isms that we experience. The interesting thing to me is that as men become fathers, there's actually growth in the corpus callosum. Why? Because we're designed to nurture, to protect, to caretake, to the simple things like changing diapers, feeding a child, rocking a child, singing to a child. Things that we haven't negotiated well, this notion of fatherhood we haven't negotiated well. I think fatherhood and sexuality are absolutely tied to each other. And the misinformation, the non-information that we have about sexuality and masculinity has birthed this culture that's obsessed with sex, because that's all manhood is about. Why? Because fathers haven't had that conversation with their kiddos. Why? Because they've been so focused on doing their career or doing their hobby or doing their whatever and not taking the time to connect in vulnerability, in intimacy with their children, to socialize their children, to communicate these truths of masculinity to their children. As a culture, we're paying for that absence. Even though the father was probably physically in the home, that absence emotionally in the home has really created the phenomenon of pornography and sexuality that we're confronted with culturally right now.
Now, that leads into the great next question in dealing with your kids. How would you teach your children, sons and daughters, about true intimacy and how to stay away from pornography and masturbation?
Yeah. I think in the recovery community, we're just now, I was at the conference 2 weeks ago for the Society for the Advancement of Sexual Health, and was actually having this dialogue with a number of notable folks from the field of sexual addiction recovery. Um, we're finding that there's really a two-tier recovery process, and that's part of what we've talked about with Saavi. Is tier one is all about blocking access to content. With your kiddos, there's a developmental space where it's really more important to block access. I've got a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old at home. I don't want them being accidentally exposed to pornography of any sort.
Right.
But when they get to be 12, 14, 15, what I know as a therapist and as a dad is that, and as a man, it's accessible. You're going to find it somewhere. They are going to be exposed to it. And what I would rather do is instead of letting that be secret or blocked, I would rather know about it. I'd rather have a product like Saavi that's going to let me know instantly when something that's been of a pornographic nature has been accessed. But again, we're back to that whole lifestyle issue. I don't just want to know about or block pornography. Alcohol stuff, drug-related stuff, suicide, cutting, you name it. Again, helping folks live healthy lifestyles isn't just about modifying their sexuality. It's a very holistic process. Parenting, the truths of sexuality and what healthy sexuality looks like isn't just contained to the sex talk one time with your sons or daughters. It's really about two things. One, communicating good information, but two, following that up with giving your children space to ask further questions. And part of that means you being in the know of what they're searching for. What are they curious about? What are they interested in? Why are they interested in that? We've got such incredible time with our children to really shape them and nurture them and answer their questions. The sex talk is important, but what's more important than just the sex talk is a consistency and follow through. And as they age, as they develop, have the sex talk at 10, 11, but have it again at 13 and let them ask questions. Have it again at 15 and let them ask questions. Have it again at 17. Let them ask questions. It's not a one and done. We dread it as parents. I understand that. But giving them space, right? Learning comes through repetition. Giving them opportunities at their different milestones developmentally and development as people to ask questions, to come back through that topic. Maybe they have the same question. Maybe they don't have any questions. That's fine. But at least as a parent, you've demonstrated a comfort with that. It's not some secret, dirty thing. If you haven't read, it's Christopher West's books, Theology of the Body. Amazing read to look at how sex is a beautiful thing. Sexuality is a beautiful thing when it operates in its appropriate context. Our role as parents is to help provide children with an understanding of that appropriate context and then to answer their questions as they wrestle with what becoming sexual means as they endure puberty, as they engage in those first romantic relationships.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's the end of the questions, unless we have one come in here right at the end. But I want to thank Dr. Bowman for taking the time. Also, I invite you to check out SaaviAccountability.com. That's SAAVI accountability.com. Great resource, and like we've talked about, there's so much more to it. It's not just about putting a program on your computer. It's about facilitating this healthy relationship with you and your children, with you and your spouse, with you and your accountability partners, and really being able to negotiate, the temptations and struggles and sexual culture that we live in, as well as the other issues that we're facing in our day-to-day lives. So I invite you to check that out, download it, and try it for yourself. So unless you have anything else, we'll go ahead and sign off and call it a day.
Yeah. All right. Thanks all. Have a good one.
Thanks.